This video is brought to you by Henson Shaving. Here in the UK, universities are something we definitely do well. Of the top 20 universities in the world, 4 are British, and many of the top institutions are highly respected around the world. Unfortunately though, many of them are now facing severe challenges, with it being reported that 43% are expected to be in deficit by this summer. As a result, universities have already started to cut back their offering. 49% of universities have closed courses, 55% have consolidated courses, 46% have removed module options, and 18% have closed departments. It's not just that universities are facing a financial crisis then. This is already starting to filter through and begin to impact students. So, in this video, we're going to have a look into the university crisis, what caused it, and how it could be resolved. Never miss a major news story by listening to the Daily Briefing, TLDR's daily rundown of everything you need to know. Listen along in your favourite podcast app or by clicking the link in the description. Now, as we referenced in the intro, universities are facing a financial crisis. This is for broadly 3 reasons. The first is that, back when the UK was a member of the European Union, universities received a huge amount of funding from the bloc, to the tune of around €800 million. Now, there are ways in which the UK has tried to replicate this funding, for example via the Shared Prosperity Fund and the EU's Horizon funding scheme, but universities have complained about this being unpredictable. In addition to this, the loss of funding from the EU could have been topped up via funding from the UK government. Not only has this not happened, but only last week, Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson announced that the Strategic Priorities Grant, which provides financial support to high-cost subjects, would be cut in the next financial year, from £1.46 billion to £1.35 billion. This is alongside capital funding, another source of government funding for universities, being almost halved, from £150 million to £84 million. The second reason for the financial crisis is inflation. In the last few years in particular, the UK has struggled with high inflation. Universities, though, had the amount that they could charge students capped. In 2012, the tuition fee cap was increased to £9,000, but had scarcely been increased since. In 2017, it was increased by £250 and is set to increase to £9,535 by the end of this year. If tuition fees had risen in line with inflation since 2012, then in April 2025, they'd be around £12,900. In addition to this, universities have also been struggling with the employer's national insurance hike, which was announced at the budget last year. In total, it's estimated that this has cost the university sector around £374 million. With costs going up and income going down, universities have essentially responded by just cutting the amount that they spend on students, with real-term spending by universities dropping significantly since 2012. It's worth mentioning here that universities have been calling for the tuition fees to increase, as it's the main source of their income. Universities UK, which represents 141 universities, suggested the fee should rise to £12,500 a year in order to meet the teaching costs, which, as we pointed out earlier, is roughly the amount that tuition fees would be had they kept up with inflation since 2012. The final reason for the crisis is the reliance on foreign students. While universities have a cap on how much they can charge domestic students, the same cap doesn't exist for international students. This has meant that universities have essentially treated international students as cash cows, using the additional revenue from them to make up for the shortfalls elsewhere. The issue is, this has had knock-on effects elsewhere. For starters, journalists noted that some universities were lowering the grade requirements for non-British students trying to get into top universities. For instance, the University of York admitted international students with the equivalent of BBC at A-level, whereas for domestic students they required 3 A's. Additionally, this has somewhat embarrassed the government. For years, the government, under both the Conservatives and Labour, have tried to reduce immigration numbers. However, despite this in the last few years, study visas and dependent visas, which essentially allow dependents of those studying in the UK to come with them, grew at an unprecedented rate. Between 2011 and 2016, the number of student and dependent visas remained stable at around 200,000 per year. Between 2016 and 2019, they began to grow, hitting 285,000 in 2019. Despite a drop in 2020 as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of visas increased hugely afterwards, reaching a peak of 652,000 in 2023. To try and get a hold of this, the Conservative government announced that, starting January 1st, 2024, only postgraduate students would be able to bring dependents. This is why from 2024 onwards, we saw a marked drop in dependent visas. Related to this though, we also saw a drop in the number of main student visas being granted. Seemingly, this change has discouraged potential international students from applying. While this is useful for the government and their immigration narrative, it certainly doesn't help the cash-strapped universities that have come to rely on international students to rectify the funding shortfall. So that's essentially how we've ended up in the situation we're now in with universities. And that's why so many of them are now scaling back on their courses and why so many of them are expecting to be in deficit by summer. What, though, could be done to save them? Well, writing for LSE, Bulent Kukay and Fazana Shane claim that there are two potential solutions. Firstly, universities should have a cap on numbers reintroduced. Now, while this might sound counterproductive, they argue that this would spread the financial burden more evenly amongst universities. Until 2014, when the coalition government scrapped them, universities had strict limits on how many students they could enrol. When the cap was lifted, it was the more prestigious universities that took on more students, at a detriment of other universities. Just last year, the high-tariff universities saw their enrolment numbers increase by 7.8% from the previous year, at the same time that low-tariff universities saw their numbers drop by 4.4%. Making the matter even worse, lower tariff universities generally have a smaller proportion of international students, meaning even this can't help their shortfall. While reintroducing student caps wouldn't immediately fix the problem, it certainly would spread the financial burden across universities more equally. The second potential solution is rather simple: to exclude student numbers from immigration statistics. The decline in international students we've seen in recent years is tied to the government's decision to no longer offer visas to dependents of undergraduates. As we've already discussed, this was driven by a desire by the government to reduce immigration. Excluding international students from the statistics would break this mentality and allow the government to re-emphasise the importance of international students. Now, it's worth pointing out that neither of these solutions would fully fix the crisis. They'd merely reduce its effect. The only way to truly solve it is to provide universities with a lot more money, something this cash-strapped government would find very difficult to do. Lots of people actively don't like shaving. It's getting increasingly expensive, with brands selling overpriced razor cartridges stuffed with useless technology. And even if you do pay for all of it, you're often still left with a bad shave, razor burn, ingrown hairs, and irritation. That's a problem that Henson aimed to solve with their razor. So, in typical TLDR style, let me explain why Henson's razors are better for 3 reasons. Firstly, Henson's AL13 razor, which they produce at their aerospace machine shop, holds blades at a perfect 30-degree angle, extending the blade just 0.0013 inches past the shave plane. That's less than the thickness of a human hair, which keeps the blade supported properly, unlike many other companies' blades, and ensures a better protection for your skin. Secondly, they're just cheaper. Those fancy blade cartridges are full of single-use junk, which makes each individual blade way more expensive than what you actually need. Henson's razor just takes totally standard blades that cost just a few cents, which means you can save money and can refresh your blades more often, so you don't need to keep dragging a dull razor across your face to try and get value out of that overpriced plastic. Finally, speaking of plastic, those cartridges aren't good for the environment either, with 2 billion razor cartridges thrown away every year in the US alone. That's not true of Henson's blades, which contain 0 plastic, even in their packaging. If you want to try it out, go to hensonshaving.com/TLDR, or click the link in the description. Then add a razor and 100 blades to your cart. Once you've done that, add our discount code TLDR at checkout, and you'll get all of those blades totally free.